We're continuing with Chapter 7 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult with new evidence linking Charlie Manson and the Son of Sam. Confession. It was shortly after midnight on August 11th. The night was muggy, the air conditioning faulty, and the rushing sound of cars speeding by on the expressway near White Plains apartment weakly mimicked the relaxing roll of the Atlantic's waves on Fire Island. I was attempting to doze off to a radio talk show and was tuned to the talented sandpaper personality of Bob Grant, who was fielding questions from listeners concerning with the Son of Sam killings. About a week before, Grant was unnerved by a caller who had credibly passed himself off as the gunman, but the police, after studying a tape of the conversation, decided it probably was an imposter. As New Yorkers offered their theories on the case to Grant, I was startled to full awakeness when he announced he'd just received a report that a suspect was under arrest. I turned on the TV in time to see Berkowitz escorted through the crowd at one police plaza. At this moment, in another part of the country, Minot, North Dakota, one John Carr was also watching television. He'd just driven to the small Northland city from New York and was sitting in his girlfriend's civilian apartment on the U.S. Air Force Base near Minot when a bulletin about Berkowitz's arrest flashed across the screen. "Oh shit," is all he said. Back in New York, someone else was responding to the capture. According to Berkowitz, an individual connected to the case and whose name neither he nor the police have revealed, phoned Police Plaza somehow, got through to Captain Joseph Borelli, and asked the task force supervisor if Berkowitz was implicating anyone else in the killing spree. The telephone conversation bothered Borelli. This was obvious. Berkowitz would later write, but Borelli, perhaps thinking of the champagne on ice, then shrugged off the incident. The spirits may have been bubbly at the NYPD, but several cups of warmed-over coffee were the extent of my celebrating as I absorbed the unfolding developments through the early morning hours. I was intrigued that Berkowitz resembled one of the composite sketches and that he resided in my former hometown of Yonkers. I'd heard of Pine Street, but was unable to fix its location. After 4 hours of sleep, I phoned my father at 7:30 a.m. and asked him about it. Though not in the city, he knew the Yonkers streets better than I did. It's off Glenwood, down the hill, just below North Broadway. It's a small one-way street. You've seen it 1,000 times, he said. What are the other streets around there? Funny you ask that. Remember last week when we were talking about the aliases in that letter? Well, Wicker Street is right behind Pine, running down to Warburton. That sounds like your King Wicker thing to me. I was very interested in Pine Street itself, and even more struck by the realization that the Breslin letters Wicker King Wicker alias apparently was a clue to the name of a street. The informant was significant because I'd been doing a little road work of my own the preceding 3 days. Since leaving Fire Island on August 1st, I'd made a full-time evening job of researching the case, having paused only on Saturday night, the 6th, to take Lynn out to dinner at a restaurant along the Sawmill River Parkway in Elmsford. Returning at midnight, I dropped her at the door before parking behind the apartment building. The residence was but a block from the Cross Westchester Expressway, and we were cognizant of the killer's penchant for striking near the parkways. Later, I'd learned that Berkowitz letter received that same day by Craig Glassman in Yonkers warned that the streets of White Plains would run red with blood. It was another small irony, but one I wouldn't forget. The next morning, Sunday, August 7th, the Daily News reprinted the entire text of the June letter to Breslin. Reading it over, I was struck by a hunch and feeling whatever that the letter contained more than met the eye. It was the note's second P.S. that drew my attention, whereas the body of the letter was flawless in its correctness and formal tone. These 5 phrases, keep 'em diggin', drive on, think positive, get off your butts, knock on coffins, were disjointed and top-heavy with slang. They simply didn't blend with the rest of the wording. Moreover, by inserting them into a postscript, the killer had set them apart and called even more attention to them, I thought. But why? It was, I finally reasoned, quite possibly a list of 5 items. As I read the P.S. again, the words keep, drive, get off, and knock suddenly seemed to spring off the page. Directions, I said out loud. Maybe they're a set of directions. Go here, do that, turn off. The letters' aliases were clues, so why not the P.S. as well? Why not include a set of directions disguised in code form? The ultimate come and get me? It was widely known that the killer was said to be taunting, daring the police to capture him. The more I looked at the wording, the more sensible it seemed. For the remainder of Sunday, the 7th, and for another 5 hours, the night of the 8th, I experimented with any kind of system that came to mind. I even went to the library and checked out books on World War II and other ciphers. I added and subtracted letters to words, substituted letters, and tried dozens of combinations, none of which made any real sense. A few times I thought I was on to it when 1 or 2 words melded together, but then the other phrases wouldn't fit in. I called 2 friends, Bob Siegel and Ben Carucci, and asked them to give some thought to the breakdown. Both men began to experiment with the phrases, and I was glad they did because I was stumped. I had been draining work. I was still convinced the answer was lurking, but gazing around the apartment, with books crumpled, papers, and overflowing ashtrays everywhere, I doubted I'd ever find it. You're burning yourself out, Lynn warned. Take a break from it and clear your head. She was right. On the night of August 9th, after the day-long respite, the waters suddenly parted. With hindsight, it seemed ridiculously simple, but in that simplicity lay the system's strength. I had been looking too deep, bypassing the obvious. The solution was a combination of 2 codes, word games, actually. One piece consisted of basic word association, a crossword puzzle type of system. The other element was based on a ploy I'd come to learn was a common satanic trick, spelling words backwards. I looked at the first phrase, keep 'em digging. Why, I wondered, would the ever-careful son of Sam, so language-conscious through the letter, slip into M-E-M, instead of using them? Maybe it wasn't a slip. M, backwards spelled me. The word preceding it, keep, then became peak, as in look for or see. The next word, digging, couldn't be reversed, but using the crossword or word association approach, it did become home. In the United Kingdom, as the dictionaries pointed out, A digging is a home, often shortened to digs. The first phrase now read, look for me home. The next expression, drive on, offered two possibilities. Reversing the word on results in no. The abbreviation for north, if drive was left as it was, the phrase became drive north. However, using word association, a drive was also a street, an avenue, a roadway, or Broadway. So the phrase could have said North Avenue, street, roadway, etc. Continuing with think positive word association was again the key. Think became head, as in mind, brain, etc., and positive after eliminating several other possibilities. Became right, as in certain, sure, etc. The phrase read head right. I was now looking at what I was sure a set of directions. My failure, as I'd later learn, was not to have looked for the wicker alias in the same way. But with the next expression in the PS, get off your butts, I soon saw that the only word Son of Sam had toyed with was butts. Via word association again, butts became ash, as in cigarette butts. The reconstructed phrase said, get off ash. Finally, through picking and choosing, knock on coffins translated to knock on pine, a coffin being a pine box. The process, once I'd caught on to the system, went rather quickly, consuming about 5 hours. I sat back at the kitchen table and printed all the... Oh boy. I sat back at the kitchen table and printed all out at once. Look for me home. North Avenue, street, roadway, etc. Head right, get off ash, knock on pine. At 10 p.m., I called both Siegel and Carucci. It's got to be right. It's got to be right, I emphasized when I explained the breakdown rationally. Each man agreed. The decoding made sense. I told them I was going to check street maps of the entire metropolitan area to try to confirm the analysis and to develop a list of possible addresses. But after I hung up from the calls, my mood changed. I started doubting myself. I also began to rationalize that the NYPD, with access to coding professionals, had assuredly traveled this road before me. Within an hour, despite encouragement from Lynn, I'd convinced myself that I was wrong about the entire matter. I also knew the police were being deluged with well-meaning tips and saw myself being filed into the crackpot folder. Now, with Berkowitz having been arrested 12 hours earlier, I studied a street map of Yonkers. I located Pine Street and backtracked across the page with my finger. North Broadway, Ashburton Avenue. It was all there. But rather than elation, I felt stupid. I had been familiar with all these Yonkers streets for years, yet I haven't even thought of them in the search. But from the map, the trail was clear. To reach David Berkowitz's apartment from any of the major routes out of New York City's site of the investigation, one would exit the parkways or throughways, drive across Ashburton Avenue, head right off Ashburton onto North Broadway, and proceed to Pine. Despite what the map told me, the entire idea of a code sounded so bizarre that I wanted more assurance. But where to get it? Once again, I was sitting close to the answer. I contacted Benoit Mandelbrot, a respected PhD in mathematics, and asked him about the odds of the analysis being correct. Gun-shy, I refrained from telling him the question concerned Son of Sam. Instead, I simply asked about the probabilities that 5 phrases could, in order, lead to a particular address, if the writer had not intended to incorporate such a ploy. Mandelbrot, who had a reputation for graciousness and patience with the uninitiated, explained that the series of phrases could be likened to a mathematical progression. The odds against 1 phrase being accurate were small. Against 2 being on target, they increased dramatically, and so forth. Finally, the odds against all 5 in order, leading step by step to the right address, were almost impossible to calculate as a coincidence or an unintentional happening. So Mandelbrot intoned, it's not a coincidence. What you have done is correct. If you sent me a letter, what do you think the odds would be that I could get step-by-step instructions to your house out of 5 successive phrases if you didn't intend to word your writing in such a manner? By using layman's language, Mandelbrot hit home in more ways than one. In the coming months, a long-term friend of Berkowitz's, Jeff Hadenberg, would tell the press, David always liked to play word games. Berkowitz himself, in discussions with doctors and others, would state that hidden messages and hints on where Son of Sam could be found were contained in the 2 letters. However, he would consistently refuse to discuss the matter of who actually wrote the Breslin letter, or at least provided the wording. The subject would eventually evolve into one of the strongest pieces of conspiracy evidence, but that was in the future. On August 11th, I was left to ponder the implication of the code. David Berkowitz was doing precious little pondering on the 11th of August. Instead, in the hours following his arrest, he was amazing the assistant district attorneys with the encyclopedia memory, as he readily confessed to all the 44 caliber shootings. He also confessed to wounding a woman in Yonkers with a rifle. The police had no record of any such incident. The development should have raised questions about the other confessions, but didn't. His recall appeared marvelous. Queens Assistant District Attorney Herb Leifer had said 3 years later, it was almost as if it was all scripted ahead of time, and it probably was. There were holes in his statements when they were compared to established information. The DA, Santucci of Queens, never liked it, but he didn't take the statement, and there was no access to Berkowitz afterwards for the prosecution. He was turned over to the psychiatrists, and of course Santucci had no control over Brooklyn or the Bronx, said Leifer. So what we had was a command performance by David, and they wanted to believe everything he said anyway. Leifer was referring to the inconsistencies and contradictions that dotted Berkowitz's confessions. Primarily, major flaws appeared in the Berkowitz version of the shooting of Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz in Brooklyn and Queens attacks, and Joanne Lomino and Donna DeMasi, Christian Freund, and Virginia Voskerchain. Other problem areas, including the Bronx shootings, may also have existed, but in some instances, without witnesses or other evidence to contradict Berkowitz's original statements, no one knew for certain. In total, there were significant discrepancies in the confessions to fully half the 44 caliber attacks, an astounding fact when one considers that the NYPD and the Bronx and Brooklyn district attorneys took no action to investigate the case after the arrest, except to clear up a handful of loose ends, as the police put it. The confessions will be published here for the first time, and all crucial passages will be included, especially those relating to the incidents at which contradictions appeared. It will be possible to identify many of the inconsistencies and to see, from the slant of the questions to Berkowitz, that areas which even then were troubling the assistant district attorneys themselves. It was shortly after 3:30 a.m., August 11th. Berkowitz, who had been awake for about 21 hours, was nonetheless showing no signs of confusion or exhaustion, as might have been expected. A large number of detectives and assistant district attorneys had gathered in the conference room of the chief of detectives at One Police Plaza. First up would be Ronald Aleo, head of the Brooklyn DA's Homicide Bureau. He would be followed by William Quinn, an assistant from the Bronx, and Martin Bracken, an assistant to Santucci in Queens. Aiello, I guess, I don't know, I have no idea how to say it. Aiello would open the session because Berkowitz was arrested by Brooklyn detectives as a result of the Moskowitz investigation. From this point, the Brooklyn DA's office would ride herd over the case. Aiello finished his introductory querying of Berkowitz, who had waived his right to an attorney, and was now ready to ask the curly-haired postal worker about the Moskowitz Violante shootings. Q. David, on July 31st, 1977, where were you living at that time? A. The Pine Street address. Q. That's up in Yonkers? A. Yes. Q. Who were you living with? A. Myself. Q. How long have you been living there? A. A little over a year. Q. Do you live with anyone, David? A. No. Berkowitz then said he'd eaten dinner that night at a Manhattan diner and drove out toward Long Island. Aiello, very much aware of the Yellow VW saga, then asked the suspect about the type of car he drove. Q. What kind of car do you have? A. A Ford Galaxy. Q. What color is it? A. Yellow. Q. How long have you had that car? A. About 3 years. Q. Is the car completely yellow? A. No. A black vinyl roof. Q. Is that a 2-door or 4-door? A. 4-door. Q. Were you using that car on the 31st? A. Yes, I was. Q. Were you there with anyone, or were you alone when you were having your dinner on 10th Avenue? A. I was alone. Q. Where did you go from there? Out to Long Island? A. Yes, Long Island to Brooklyn. Q. Do you have any purpose in going out on Long Island? Just to take a ride? A. Purposely going out, killing somebody. Q. Did you have anyone in mind at the time? Or anyone you might come across? A. Whoever would just come around when I was told who to get. Q. Who told you who to get? A. Sam Carr. Who is Sam Carr? A. My master. Q. Where does Sam live? A. In Yonkers. Q. Is Sam the father of Wheat Carr? A. Yes. Q. How long have you known Sam approximately? A. Probably well as Sam, I'd just say a little over a year and a half. Q. Is that his actual name, Sam Carr? A. That's the name he goes by, yes. Q. Did you have any discussion with Sam that particular day about finding someone to kill? A. I just had my orders. Q. Do you want to tell me how you got those orders? There's little footnotes down here I'm reading. Berkowitz claimed in 1977 that his relationship with Sam Carr was only mystical, that he didn't actually know him. Yet in this early post-arrest comment, he acknowledges knowing that Sam had a daughter named Wheat. A. Yes, he told me through his dog, as he usually does. It's not really a dog. It just looks like a dog. It's not. He gave me an idea of where to go. When I got the word, I didn't know who I would go out to kill, but I would know when I saw the right people. Q. Did you have a location in mind, David? A. Let's just say the area I was in, Bensonhurst, was one of the several I rode through. Q. About what time did you reach Bensonhurst section? A. 2 o'clock. No, yeah, 2 o'clock. About 2 o'clock. A. Where did you park? A. On Bay 17th between Shore Parkway and Cropsey Avenue. Q. Are you familiar with that neighborhood? A. I have been there before. Q. On what occasion were you here? Were you there? A. I'd say past a week. Q. Prior to going there that night, you were there? A. Yes. Q. What brought you there on that occasion? A. I had to go kill somebody. What can I tell you? Do you recall where you parked your car exactly on the block? A. Up by a fire hydrant midway between Cropsey and Shore Parkway. Q. Did you realize you parked your car by a hydrant? A. Yes, I saw the police give me a summons. Q. How did you see that? I was walking away. I saw a police car coming up Shore Parkway and turn onto Bay 17th. Going up that street, I had a feeling they would go by my car. I saw the policeman give me a summons. Then they went slowly up the block near Cropsey Avenue and pulled over again. I watched for about 10 minutes, and they got out of the car. I don't know what they were doing, but I went back to my car. There was a ticket on it. Q. Where were you? What were you wearing that night? A. A blue denim jacket, blue dungarees. Q. What did you have under your denim jacket? A. A light brown shirt. Q. When you went back to your car, did you take that ticket off the windshield? A. Yes. Q. What did you do with it? A. I put it inside the car. Q. Tell me what you did from there. A. I was still walking around the area, went back to the park, sat down for a while. Q. Where were you sitting? On the bench? A. Sitting on a bench. Q. Did you have a weapon with you at the time? A. Yes. Q. What weapon? A. 44 Bulldog. Q. Then what did you do, David? A. I saw that couple, Stacy Moskowitz and her boyfriend. They were by the swings. They went back to their car. I don't know how much time elapsed, maybe 10 minutes or so. I walked up to their car. Q. Were there other cars parked, or did other cars come eventually? A. Eventually. Q. You say you saw this Stacy Moskowitz car, then you saw the one up in front of them? A. No. The one up from there. No. The one up front was there before. Q. Then Stacy Moskowitz came afterwards? A. Yes. Q. Did you see them get out of the car? A. No. I was too far down in the park. I saw them walking. I saw a couple by the swings. I don't know it was them. I saw them go back to the car. Q. Then what did you do? A. I don't know. I waited for a time. I don't know how much time elapsed. I just went to the car. I just walked up to it, pulled the gun, and put it, I stood a couple of feet from the window. A. Were the windows open or closed? A. Open, and I fired. Berkowitz then described how he sprayed the car with bullets. Q. Then what did you do? A. I turned around and I ran out of the park through those townhomes, the garden apartments where Mrs. Davis and Mary Lyons lived. Q. You say you ran through the park. You came out of the park eventually? A. Yes. Did you go out and exit or hole in the fence? Or a hole in the fence? Did you go out and exit or a hole in the fence? That makes more sense. A. There was a hole in the fence. ALO now had several more problems. Berkowitz, who said he'd arrived in the neighborhood at 2 a.m., also said he knew Tommy Ziano's car was at the scene before Violante's, and at a location Berkowitz said he hadn't walked to yet. Violante had pulled into the parking spot between 1:40 and 1:45. Moreover, Berkowitz had told the police that Ziano had been the original target, but was spared when he pulled forward. This action occurred at approximately 1:35, a full 25 minutes before Berkowitz said he parked 2 blocks away. This wasn't simply a matter of confusion regarding the time. Berkowitz said he arrived just before the police ticketed his car, an action recorded by the 2:05 time on the ticket. Aiello was also faced with Berkowitz's saying he left the scene in a different direction from that of the man who ran through the park exit and entered the yellow VW. Certainly concerned about the VW chase, Aiello then asked Berkowitz how he left the area. Berkowitz confounded the issue even more by saying he drove as far north as he could on 18th Avenue, a street located east of Bay 17th. This route took him in a completely different direction from that of the VW driver. Aiello then concluded his questioning by asking Berkowitz about the variety of weapons he owned and about the origin of the .44. Berkowitz said his army pal Billy Dan Parker had purchased it for him while Berkowitz was visiting him in Houston in June 1976. I'm going to read a footnote on the previous page. In a later letter to psychiatrists, Berkowitz contradicted this statement by saying, I saw her and her boyfriend making out in the car. Then they walked over the walk bridge and went along the path by the water, and then came to where I was by the swings. This was to the answer of, no, I was too far down in the park. I saw them walking. I saw a couple by the swings. I didn't know it was them. I saw them go back to the car. I gotta read those more on point, don't I? Aiello's interrogation about the most infamous homicide in New York's history had lasted 32 minutes. He did not follow up on the obvious discrepancies in Berkowitz's account. Berkowitz's statement that he removed the ticket from his windshield was confirmed by Mrs. Davis, who saw him do it. However, Mrs. Davis, whose account was supported by her companion Howard Bohan, insisted that Berkowitz didn't even return to the park at that late time, 2:20, but instead left to follow the police car. Also, at no time did Aiello ask Berkowitz to explain why, if his confession was accurate, did he back over. Well, if his confession was accurate, he was back over on Bay 17th Street again at 2:33 when he passed Mrs. Davis as she walked her dog just 2 minutes before the shots were fired. Berkowitz, simply put, claimed to be in the park the entire time, while Mrs. Davis's account twice put him well away from the shooting site. Beyond these and other footnoted contradictions were, of course, the matters of the yellow VW, the clothes the killer wore, and the gunman's physical appearance and hairstyle radically differ from Berkowitz's. Nobody wanted to upset the apple cart, Herb Leifer would later say. They didn't want to go into any areas that might upset David or rattle him into changing his mind about confessing. Indeed, the only trick question Aiello threw Berkowitz concerned the bench sitting, and Berkowitz fell for it. The actual killer, according to Violante, had been leaning against a restroom building and not seated on a bench when the two victims walked within several feet of him, another encounter Berkowitz failed to confess to. Berkowitz would later create still another version of the shooting that again contradicted established fact. After telling Aiello he'd simply walked up to the passenger side of the victim's auto and fired into it, as the killer actually did, he told the psychiatrist, "I walked straight to the car. When I got to the rear of it, I looked around, then stepped onto the sidewalk. There was no sidewalk. I moved right to the driver's side and pulled the gun out. Violante and Stacy were shot through the passenger's window. In fact, not a single Son of Sam victim had been fired on from the driver's side." Aiello, who is now a New York State Supreme Court judge, gave way to William Quinn, an assistant district attorney from the Bronx. Quinn managed to better Aiello's interrogation time record, consuming only 27 minutes to question Berkowitz about 3 murders, those of Donna Loria, Valentina Serrani, and Alexander Esau. There was little noteworthy information in these confessions except that Berkowitz had Serrani and Esau seated in the wrong positions in their auto, a mistake he probably picked up from erroneous newspaper reports. He also forgot to mention that a letter had been left at the scene, but Quinn was quick to suggest the answer. Q. Now what did you do after you fired the 4 shots? A. I ran into my car and got in my car and drove off. Q. Did you leave anything at the scene? A. Oh yeah, right, the letter. I had it in my pocket. It was a letter addressed to Captain Borelli. Quinn had some concern about the Breslin letter and the few other matters as well. Q. Did you write the letter to Mr. Breslin? A. Yes, I did. Q. And you wrote it yourself? A. Yes. Q. Why did you mail it from New Jersey? A. I was there at the time, hunting. Q. Did you ever admit to anyone before tonight what you had done in relation to the Bronx case? A. No. Q. To anybody at all? A. No. Q. Did you write any other letters beside the 2 we mentioned? A. Not addressed to anyone. Q. Ever mail them? A. No. Q. Ever call the police? A. No. Q. Ever identify yourself as Son of Sam? A. No. Speaking to Quinn about the Serrani Esau killings, Berkowitz had known without prompting that the words chubby behemoth were contained in the letter left at the scene. Since the note was not made public, Quinn had reason to be satisfied Berkowitz was involved in the shootings. In his confession to the murder of Donna Loria and the wounding of Jody Valente, Berkowitz stuck close to the facts of the case. Still, Quinn had some concerns. Did you have the same hairstyle as you have now? Question. A. Yes. Q. You didn't have a wig? A. No. Q. Had you followed either one of the 2 girls earlier in the evening, 9 or 9:30? This was a reference to a suspicious yellow car, smaller than Berkowitz's, cruising the area at the time. A. No. Martin Bracken, an assistant district attorney from Queens, began his questioning at 4:34 a.m. by asking about the wounding of Carl DeNaro as he sat on the passenger side of Rosemary Keenan's navy blue Volkswagen, which Berkowitz incorrectly said was red. He said he fired 5 times at the car and that he intended to kill just the woman. I thought she was in the front seat, passenger side. It was very dark. There were no witnesses to the shooting. The person who pulled the trigger, however, had fired wildly, unlike the Loria shooter. The remainder of the questioning about this attack was sketchy, and Berkowitz's answers were brief and apparently factual. The shootings of Joanne Lomino and Donna Demasi were another matter. It was this incident which resulted in 2 composite sketches of a gunman who didn't remotely resemble Berkowitz and a report from a witness that the shooter had fled carrying the weapon in his left hand. Berkowitz is right-handed. Q. Who did you fire at? A. The 2 girls. I'm just going to say question answer. Question. And where were they seated? Answer. They were standing by the porch of one of the girls' homes. Question. Did you walk up to the location where they were seated? Answer. Yes. Question. Do you recall what you were wearing that night? Answer. No. Question. Do you recall the weather conditions? Answer. A bit chilly, clear. Question. And could you describe what happened and when you came up to the 2 girls? Answer. I walked up and I was going to shoot them. I tried to be calm about it and not scare them, but they were frightened of me and started to move away. And I asked them. I didn't know what to say to calm them down, so I said I was looking for an address. I'm looking for a certain address or something like that, and at that time I was a few feet from them, and I pulled out the gun and opened fire. Question. What position were you in when you fired? Answer. I was at maybe 8 or 9 feet from the steps or something. Question. And did you go into a crouched position at the time? Answer. Well, I just picked up the gun. They were like running up the steps. I stood upright. Question. And how many times did you fire? A. Answer. 5. Question. And did you use both hands or one hand to hold the gun? Answer. Both, I believe. Question. And when you fired, did you hit anyone? Answer. Yes, both girls. Question. Did you see what happened after you fired? Answer. No, they just fell down. Question. When you fired the shots at the 2 girls, were they face to face with you, or were their backs to you? Answer. Face to face. Question. And were they standing still or running? Answer. They were running. Question. In which direction were they running in relation to you? Answer. Towards the door, but they were running on top and the door wouldn't open. They looked at me, facing me. Question. Do you recall what you were wearing that day? Answer. No, I don't. Question. Do you have the same hairstyle? Did you have the same hairstyle? Answer. Yes. Anything physically different about you on that day? Answer. No. Question. And did you see anybody else? And did you see anybody besides the 2 girls as you were getting out of your car? Answer. Yes. Question. Who? Answer. An elderly woman at the porch of her house, and I think she was putting on or turning off a porch light. Question. Now, did she say anything to you at this time? Answer. No. Question. Now, did she look at you? Answer. I believe she did, yes. Question. Did you ever have occasion to get out of the car prior to the first time you went out to the girls? Answer. Just to urinate or something. Did you get around Hillside Avenue, 262nd Street? Answer. No. Question. Now, did you use the same gun that you used on the prior occasions, the one in Queens and the Bronx? Answer: yes. Question: now, did you use the same ammunition that you purchased in Houston? Answer: yes. Berkowitz twice said the girls were running up the steps. However, Joanne Lominos stated to prosecutors, "We were standing by the sidewalk talking. We walked over to the porch and we were standing for about 5 minutes. I heard a voice, then turned around and a guy pulled a gun and started shooting at us." She added, "I turned around and the gun was already out and he was firing. The girls weren't running anywhere." Berkowitz also confessed that the victims were face to face with him. Joanne Lomino struck first, was shot in the back. She further stated, "I had my back turned towards him, and he just had the gun out and he fired it. My back was toward him, though." Bracken's question to Berkowitz as to whether he'd gotten out of his car at Hillside and 262nd was based on the girl's observation of a suspicious man, possibly the gunman, hiding behind a telephone pole at the location, which wasn't far from the shooting site. His question about whether or not the same .44 had been used related to the lack of ballistics evidence linking the bullets from this shooting to any others. Berkowitz later told a psychiatrist that he just popped out of the lot around the corner before approaching the girls. There's no such lot. Bracken, who conducted the most comprehensive of the three assistant district attorneys' interrogations, then shifted gears and began to question Berkowitz about the murder of Christine Freund as she sat in her boy's friend's car in Forest Hills on January 30th, 1977. This Berkowitz confession also went unchallenged. Later in the narrative, the in-depth follow-up investigation of the Freund murder will be explained in detail. These are among the key areas of the confession I would be analyzing. I'm not going to read the Q&A anymore. That's taking up too much time. Where did you park the car? I parked on a street that runs parallel to Long Island Railroad. It's a small winding street. I don't know the name of it. And did you get out of the car at that time? Yes, I did. And where did you go? In the vicinity of Austin Street. And can you tell me in your own words what happened? Yes, I was walking in the opposite direction and saw them walking from the restaurant to the car parked in Station Plaza by the railroad station. We just passed each other. We crisscrossed. We almost touched shoulders. You passed by them? Yes. They got into their car and I saw Mr. Deal get in and he reached over and opened up the front door for Miss Freund, and I was standing 4 or 5 feet away, and I watched them get into the car, and I guess a minute went by and I opened fire. When you approached them, did you approach from the front or the back? Back. And what were you wearing on that occasion? A heavy winter clothing. Berkowitz then described how he fired 3 shots through the passenger's window, aiming only at Christine Freund. He said he used only 3 bullets rather than the 4 or 5 as in most other incidents because I only had 1 person to shoot. Later, Bracken returned to the shoulder-touching occurrence. In relation to the car, where Deal and Freund were sitting, where did you first see them when you crisscrossed or almost touched shoulders? 71st and Continental. 71st and Continental are the same street, with 2 names. Berkowitz actually meant to say Continental and Station Plaza. And they were walking towards their car? Yes. And you were where at the time? I was coming from walking parallel to the railroad. I see. So they went diagonal past you? Would that be correct? Yes. And where was your car parked in relation to the railroad? You have those winding streets. It was in there. The murder of Virginia Vachericane took place less than a block from the Freund shooting at approximately 7:30 p.m. on March 8, 1977. What happened that night when you were in the area? I just walked around all night. How long were you walking around? Maybe an hour and a half. And then what happened? I saw Miss Vaquerichain, and I had to shoot. She was coming up as she was coming up. We was walking in opposite directions. And when you saw her, what did you do? I pulled out the gun from my pocket and fired one shot into her face. And what did you do after that? I turned around and ran towards my car. Do you recall what she looked like? Vaguely. Could you tell us, please? She had a long, pretty face. There was a shadow effect, long, wavy hair. Showing you this map, you see where the tennis courts are at the top. Where were you parked in relation to the tennis courts? Adjacent to the tennis courts, the same street as the railroad. Now, after you shot her and you point that you got to your car, did you see anyone? Yes, there was an elderly man walking. I ran by him. Did you happen to see anyone jogging in the area? This was a reference to Amy Johnson and her brother. No, I did not. Did you say anything to the elderly man? I said, "Hi, mister." And what were you wearing on that occasion? I think my ski jacket dungarees. Were you wearing a hat? A watch cap. And what type of a hat was that? A brown watch cap. The shooter's cap was also striped. And was that in your duffel bag that was taken by the police today? Yes. Do you remember the type of evening it was? The weather conditions? Cold. Can you describe what the victim, was wearing and doing at that time? She was just walking home from school. She had a long coat and boots. She was carrying her books. How far away from her were you when you fired? About 2 feet. The glaring problems with this Berkowitz version are evident. Primarily the police department, after initially nominating Ski Cap as the killer, changed course and said Ski Cap was a witness and the Berkowitz look-alike who followed jogger Amy Johnson and her brother. Tony was its prime target. The person almost certainly Berkowitz, as the composite sketch illustrated, was hatless and wearing a beige raincoat, not the type of clothing Ski Cap wore. Now in custody, Berkowitz was trying to claim he had been Ski Cap and had indeed done the shooting. The scenario was totally confused and contradictory. Berkowitz was trying to become another individual, a person he didn't resemble, who was some 3 inches shorter, and who was dressed differently, just as he'd done in confessing to the Brooklyn shooting. The police department, which had initially done the about-face prime suspect, now would do another one, accepting Berkowitz's version and still leaving one suspect, actually the shooter, unaccounted for. There were other discrepancies, too. Berkowitz said he pulled the gun from his pocket. He later wrote it was in a plastic bag. He said the night was cold, when in fact it was spring-like. He said he spoke the words, "Hi, mister," as he ran by Ed Marlowe. Marlowe, however, had reported Ski Cap saying, "Oh, Jesus." Berkowitz also confessed that Miss Vaquerichain was wearing a long coat, whereas police reports show the garment was actually a short jacket. Berkowitz's statement that he was in the area for more than an hour is consistent with the reports of Amy Johnson and others who had seen both the Berkowitz look-alike and apparently Ski Cap in the neighborhood well before the shooting. It was worth remembering that Berkowitz look-alike had somehow managed to again appear ahead of Miss Johnson and her brother after they'd passed him the first time, and they were jogging. The scenario strongly suggests he was driven ahead of the pair and dropped off. Berkowitz also confessed that after the shooting he ran to his car, which was parked near the railroad tracks only about a block from the shooting site. He later contradicted that account by telling a psychiatrist he was parked several blocks further west in another direction. Martin Bracken's final set of questions concerned the wounding of Judy Placido and Sal Lupo as they sat in a borrowed car seat near Eliphas Discotheque. I've never seen that word before. Discotheque. Eliphas Discoth? I have no idea. Berkowitz simply said he parked 2 blocks south and 4 blocks west of the disco, wandered around the area, saw the couple seated in the car, approached, fired, then ran back to his own auto and fled. The troublesome areas regarding this attack involved the man with the mustache and the yellow Nova-sized car as well as other factors, described in Chapter 3. However, after the arrest, a friend of Lupo's told the Daily News this guy, Berkowitz, was finally in Eliphas 5 minutes before the shooting. He added he'd seen Berkowitz speak with a young woman, then turn around to say aloud to a few people, "That girl is a snob." If this identification was correct, it seriously compromised Berkowitz's confession to the shooting as well. It was now 5:20 a.m., and the questioning of Berkowitz was over. Bracken spent 40 minutes interrogating the suspect about 5 different shootings. The verdict was now in, and the newspapers churning off the presses were already telling the story. As relayed by the police, Berkowitz was crazy. He acted on the orders of a barking dog who was the intermediary for Sam Carr, who was really a demon. Berkowitz's master. Berkowitz had acted alone. The biggest case was over. In the early morning hours, Miss Cacilia Davis was awakened by loud knocking on her door. "We're from the police," the voice behind it said. According to Mrs. Davis, releasing the latch, she was greeted by Daily News reporter William Federici and a photographer. Federici's name had appeared on the byline of the "Make Mrs. Davis a Target" story that was on the newsstand at that moment. Federici said Mrs. Davis had been a longtime friend of Joseph Strano, the detective from the 10th homicide, who took down her account to the night of the shooting and later accompanied her on the shopping trip during which they unsuccessfully searched for a jacket identical to the one Berkowitz had worn. Now having obtained Mrs. Davis's name and address from some source or other, Federici was inside the comfortable, beautifully furnished Bay 17th Street apartment, ready to hear the prized confidential witness's own first-person story. Hesitant at first, but reassured since the killer was now arrested, Mrs. Davis agreed to pose for photos with her dog and to accompany Federici to the offices of the Daily News in Manhattan. Mrs. Davis picks up the account. "I went with them. They told me Strano said it was all right to talk to them, so I told them what happened that night." I interrupted. "Did you tell them about Berkowitz's car moving, leaving the neighborhood, blowing the horn and all that?" "Yes," she replied. "I told Federici all about it. Strano already knew about the car. Strano knew, and then I told Federici about it. Before the arrest, the significance of the cars leaving the area was minimal. The action occurred 15 minutes before the shooting, and no one knew the owner of the flagged auto would turn out to be Berkowitz, the alleged killer. But the Galaxy's departure now took on a new and very demanding significance. Federici took down what I told him, and it was typed out. I looked at it, and it was just as it happened," Mrs. Davis continued, "and then Strano came in." According to Mrs. Davis, Detective Strano appeared at the Daily News, read the draft of her first-person story, and then suggested Mrs. Davis might be hungry. She then accompanied a female reporter downstairs for something to eat. She said, "When we came back up, the part about him, Berkowitz, taking off the ticket and blowing the horn, and all was taken out." The next day, Friday, August 12th, Mrs. Davis's story, under her byline, no less, appeared on the page 2 of the news. There was no reference to her earlier sighting of the Galaxy's pre-shooting maneuvers, which of course occurred at the time Berkowitz claimed he'd been stalking his victims 2 blocks away in the park. Strano also knew from his own DD5 report that Mrs. Davis had barely entered her apartment when the shots rang out. He'd witnessed that she heard the gunfire while unleashing the dog. If someone, as I later did, thought to measure the distances and check time factors, serious questions would also arise. In fact, a special edition of the news published the morning after the arrest, a detective was quoted saying she was standing on her stoop, unleashed her dog when she heard the shots and the squeal of the horn. This account was inaccurate by about 20 seconds, but the red light was definitely flashing. Unless Berkowitz was a track star, the police had problems. Accordingly, in Mrs. Davis's story the following day, the issue was avoided thusly. It was strange to see someone with a leisure suit on in the heat before I went to sleep. I started reading the paper, and I heard what it sounded like, a long boom and then a horn. Through clever writing, the story implied that Mrs. Davis was lounging around in her apartment for some time before hearing the shots, which wasn't true. In still another article in the news the same day, on which Federici, Mrs. Davis' ghostwriter, shared a byline, the story was further embellished and distorted. He, the killer, walked away. She went home. 15 minutes later, emphasis added, she went to her window to turn on the air conditioning. She heard a loud bang and then the sound of a horn blowing. This article managed to contradict the other, even though both appeared in the same newspaper on the same day, with the same reporter directly involved in both versions. One said the witness heard the shots as she opened a paper, which was technically true. The other said she'd heard them while turning on her air conditioner. The stories, through inaccuracies in one and writing devices in the other, effectively submerged the critical time and distance factors. What actually transpired between Federici and Strano in the city room while Mrs. Davis was downstairs isn't known for certain. Perhaps the inaccuracies were simply the result of mistakes in the writing process, but it's more likely that they weren't. A Brooklyn Assistant District Attorney, Stephen Wax, later confirmed that Mrs. Davis told him Berkowitz's car drove away before the shootings. Wax said he didn't hear of the incident until the day before Berkowitz pleaded guilty in May 1978, 9 months later, when Mrs. Davis explained it to him. It seems the Brooklyn DA's office hadn't bothered to interview its own witnesses during all that time. No lineups, no checking or verifying statements from Berkowitz, etc. This lack of follow-through is illustrative of the authorities' aversion to perhaps compiling informants they didn't want to address concerning what lay beneath the surface of the case. The now you see it, now you don't intense hunt of the VW is another example of this syndrome. The fact is this: the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office acknowledged receiving evidence from the star witness that seriously undermined the veracity of Berkowitz's confession. This information, which went hand in hand with the yellow VW evidence already known by authorities, was obtained before Berkowitz pleaded guilty, but the Brooklyn DA did nothing to halt or delay that proceeding or to mount an investigation. When I asked Strano about this matter, he claimed that the May 1978 session was the first time he'd heard about the Ford leaving the area. I suggested to Strano that perhaps he was making this claim because, for a variety of reasons, he'd not told the DA's office about the incident immediately and had no choice but to plead ignorance in Wax's office that day. This suggestion was denied by Strano. Mrs. Davis simply says that Strano is not telling the truth. When Mrs. Davis was first interviewed by me in the spring of 1979, I was accompanied by Marianne Roach, an editorial employee of the New York Times, and freelance reporter James Mittiger. Mrs. Davis's attorney was also present at the interview and was a friend and neighbor of the witness. Until that moment, Mrs. Davis wasn't even vaguely aware of the technical details of Berkowitz's confession, which hadn't been released publicly, and had no idea of the importance of her account, which was supported by Howard Bohan, who was also interviewed. It was only during the course of this and subsequent meetings, when the reconstruction of the murder scene was explained to her, that Mrs. Davis came to realize her sightings effectively eliminated Berkowitz as the gunman that night. The knowledge made her fearful. She was apprehensive of retaliation from the real killer, as she put it, and she was also concerned that her testimony might free Berkowitz. "He's still a killer. I don't want that to happen," she said on several occasions. She was assured the intent wasn't to free Berkowitz, but to bring his accomplices to ground if possible. Ironically, the police's own star witness had almost destroyed their effort to depict Berkowitz as a lone, demented killer. Meanwhile, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office stood steadfastly, refused to act. District Attorney Eugene Gold would turn a deaf ear to the mounting evidence and continue to endorse the Berkowitz alone position. As for Strano and Federici, one is free to arrive at an independent conclusion. Federici subsequently left the news for a job in a private industry. Strano, along with 24 other members of the NYPD, was promoted just 9 days after Berkowitz's arrest in the largest advancement ceremony in the history of the New York City Police Department. Down and out in March, the NYPD was now basking in the glow of its success in the Son of Sam case. Its status was restored. Its rating was sky high in the public mind, and its promotion ceremony topped it off. In coming months, a split would develop within the previously united legions of the 10th homicide. Some detectives, including Strano and John Valtosio, became somewhat concerned as Detective Ed Zigo, who was attempting to obtain a search warrant at the time of the capture, sought to claim a considerable amount of undeserved credit and fame. This knowledge is first-hand, and as I spoke with Strano and others, including Zigo, on several occasions during this period, Zigo was moving in his own direction, but in conversations with others, subtle questions and hints concerning books and movies invariably were present. Mrs. Davis also said that a fight had erupted between members of the opposing camps at an awards function in Brooklyn at which she was present. Zigo, who may or may not have landed any blows at this alleged policeman's brawl, did beat the others to another punch at least. After retiring several years later, he collaborated on a supposedly factual TV movie about the case with producers Sonny Grosso, himself an ex-member of the NYPD. The film, which first aired on CBS in October 1985, was titled Out of the Darkness, but rather than shedding any new light on the movie, distorted and fictionalized the investigation, the events surrounding the arrest, and Zigo's role in each. CBS wasn't the only victim of a whitewash. In 1981, author Lawrence Klausner published a book which purported to tell the true story, which of course meant that Berkowitz was a salivating, demon-haunted madman who acted alone. Klausner was fed a large plateful of distortions by a handful of task force supervisors and others, all of which he dutifully digested and reported as fact. He literally canonized Captain Joseph Borelli, Sergeant Joe Coffey, and the Omega Task Force members whose investigation was, despite Klausner's platitudes, an expensive failure. But these subplots were beyond my vision of the future on August 11, 1977, the day after the arrest. I was in White Plains holding clues from the Breslin letter I suspected were beyond Berkowitz's ability to concoct based on background information that had already surfaced. I was also troubled that he didn't remotely resemble some of the composite sketches of the killer, and that reporters I'd read of the Moskowitz's murder and Mrs. Davis's role seemed contradictory. Following that trail, I'd look up all the car listings in the telephone book and learned, to my considerable interest, that a number for a John Wheat car existed at Sam Carr's address. John Wheat and the John Wheaties alias in the Breslin letter, the discovery was intriguing. In an older directory, I noticed another listing, that of a Car 3 studio. That heightened my interest because Breslin was said to have been printed in the style of an illustrator or cartoonist. The first seed of the conspiracy investigation were now planted. There was no way of knowing that official hindrances and roadblocks would result in a long growing season. That's it for that chapter. We come up on chapter 8 some other time.